Hello and welcome to this video on schnapps. That is schnapps and not snaps. Schnapps are a common form of alcoholic beverage. Although they are decreasingly found in the market, they do make up a reasonably large portion of the market share, or at least in comparison to some other forms of alcoholic beverage. Although retaining a presence, they are dwindling. The other issue with them is that there is a big problem in defining schnapps. If we were to go straight to Wikipedia, schnapps is a type of alcoholic beverage that may take several forms, including distilled fruit brandies, herbal liqueurs, infusions, and flavoured liqueurs, and made by adding fruit syrup, spices, or artificial flavourings to neutral grain spirits. This is a great definition because just about everything could fit into it. Thank you, Wikipedia. But no, this is actually something of a serious problem. It makes labelling somewhat opaque and does not allow for an easy choice of beverage. For the most part, we can split schnapps into North American and European schnapps. The difference is kind of straightforward when you think of it as a historical product. The first and perhaps easiest way to look at this is a schnapps spelt with one P is European. A schnapps spelt with two P's is American. Alright, things are more complicated than that. European schnapps are a distilled spirit. They're generally made from fruit juices that have been fermented, and they're more than 30% alcohol by volume. They will be consumed neat or somewhat similar. American schnapps are more like an infusion of flavour, and generally they're something like a whole fruit put into a relatively straight or pure alcohol like ethanol, and then a little bit of sugar is added to make it into a liqueur, and the end result is somewhere around 25% alcohol by volume. And then they're used as a mixer in cocktails. Eventually, you get two very different alcoholic products. Both of these are called schnapps. As mentioned, you can sometimes tell them apart, as the European version generally has only one P, while the American has two, but this is by no means a reliable method. When we look at the European version of schnapps, we can say schnapps is most often used as a form of, let's say, unaged brandy. The brandy typically goes into a barrel and stays there for at least 5 years. In this case, it's just the extracted distillate, and generally a distillate of some sort of fruit fermentation. Not always, mind you, but you can also look at things like herbal extracts, let's say, and similar. Essentially, so long as you have something that's been at least vaguely made in the form of a brandy. As a product, schnapps is most prevalent in places like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Think of places that historically had very high mountains and a strong need for very powerful alcohol. This may also, at least in part, be why your grandma has her medicinal brandy or other alcoholic beverage such as schnapps. It's not alcohol, it's medicine, remember? Schnapps is also the name that is derived from German. It's a spelling for a strong type of alcohol and can be traced all the way back to roughly 1400. And to get schnapps, at least in the European context, we have the various kinds of fruit juices, typically some sort of grain added for extra alcohol content, herbs for flavour, and occasionally even things like beets, potatoes, and similar. And these are all fermented and then distilled. This gives you a strong and sometimes very unique flavour, and then it's essentially sold as it is bottled. Because of how they are and how they're made and what they are, European schnapps are typically going to be significantly more dry. That is, there is less sugar left over in the distillate, and as such, you can compare them, at least in this term, to the North American, or largely, let's say, American varieties, which are generally going to be sweeter. They're used more along the lines of a between-course sort of thing. A palate cleanser, if you will. By contrast, we have the North American style, which is, for all intents and purposes, a liqueur. It is much sweeter. The addition of that sugar later on makes it thicker, sweeter, and to a certain extent helps with balancing flavours in some cases. It's more or less a America and Canada kind of thing, rather than going through Middle and then South America. They are made nearly always by taking a neutral grain spirit, so for all intents and purposes you can just say vodka. And then you combine it with the fruit syrup to give it that sweetness and flavour, or in some cases spices, herbs, in other instances soaking fruit in it for a time, and so on. Because you are adding that sugar, you do get a liqueur though. and this is where we take issue with the inability to properly differentiate schnapps and schnapps. If you are going to be consuming schnapps though, you may have had experience with one where you thought, this is great, I want to try it again, but you want something different this time, and so you go off and buy another, and suddenly this is terrible and you never want to drink schnapps again. And it's likely because you've bought a different variety. In some instances, and particularly let's say immature palates would prefer things like say butterscotch flavours, apple flavours and similar. These are more likely to be the American version. At the same time, it also makes them useful for addition to things like foods, cocktails and mixers. It's the ability to add this sweeter flavour. It means you can add a more rounded edge to it, particularly if you're cooking something. For instance, if you want to make a sauce, the addition of a caramel or butterscotch type schnapps to something allows you to create something that's got a much more, let's say, a spirited flavour without having to add extra sugar. As we mentioned earlier on, typically speaking, European schnapps are consumed neat. Neat is a simple way of saying you just drink the schnapps by themselves. I think of, well, for lack of a better and very crude way of describing it, like taking shots of whiskey or tequila. Strictly speaking, you shouldn't be taking shots of whiskey unless it's something terrible, but even then it seems like a waste. Nonetheless, schnapps are consumed in a similar manner. Small aperitif type glasses, and consumed little bit by little bit, and not all in one go. This is also why they're sometimes described as a digestion aid. It's something to calm the stomach after a large meal, and often a very rich meal. On the other hand, you don't necessarily want to consume them just as is. Some schnapps will be fine being served at room temperature, and generally as mentioned a small aperitif type glass or taster. In other instances, you may want it to be slightly cooled. One of the reasons why you want it to either be slightly cooled or at room temperature and in a small glass is that you want to be able to enjoy both the taste and smell. On the other hand, if it's part of a mixer, well, you're combining it with who knows what else and essentially ruining whatever it is you're making, but we would argue that this is by no means actual schnapps. It's some sort of bizarre bastardized infusion, and Americans having their way with good alcohol that they have no idea how to handle. And now that we've triggered Americans in the comments section, this is what schnapps and schnapps are, although they are very different unless you know that there's a difference. And if you don't, it might be forgivable to think they are just two different spellings of the same word and refer to the same beverage. But no. In other cases, your product may not even differentiate in the spelling of the product, so you might not know if you're getting American style or European style. And this is going to be a bit of a challenge. You might be expecting something much sweeter or drier and be very rudely surprised. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions or suggestions that you have below.